Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm the Gnarly Gnome. This is Cincy Brewcast, the voice of Cincy Craft, although we're in Dayton. The last time I did a show from Dayton, it was a elaborate April Fool's joke. I went over to Branch and Bone, and I sat down, and I told everybody that we were changing to the Dayton Brewcast, and then just recorded a regular episode from Branch and Bone, just because I wanted to do it. And this is not an April Fool's joke, and we're not really talking about a Dayton brewery. Although we are at a Dayton brewery, we're at Moeller Brew Barn because I think that they are the only place in downtown Dayton that opens early enough on a Tuesday afternoon for us to sit down and record. We're actually here just to sit down and talk to David Nilsen, who I've wanted to get you on the show for a very long time. I've been a fan of your writing and your work in general for a very long time. So. Yeah. Glad that you finally made the time or were able to sit down and make this happen.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
We've got some fun stuff that you have in the works that I definitely want to talk about. And we might dive into Dayton beer a little bit. We'll see how things go. But beautiful, nice Dayton day.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good introduction to the city this time of year, I think.
It's dreary and rainy. This space here is such a cool space right across the street from the ballpark, and yet it's just dreary and not even like a pretty day. It doesn't do it justice. But
yeah, they got a pretty prime location here. This is a nice piece of real estate to get a
you can
patio
sit on the patio upstairs and just watch the baseball game.
Yeah.
Like I don't know of another, especially in this part of the country, another brewery that has anything like that. Even in other parts of the country, like it's always some kind of big beer brewery that might have that space. Like it's awesome. It's it's really cool. There's a lot of fun stuff happening in downtown Dayton. We might have to talk about it actually.
Absolutely.
The more I start thinking about it.
I'm always willing to give a sales pitch for Dayton.
Let's start with you though. Kind of give people a rundown. Who are you, and what is your relationship with craft beer?
Yeah, so I'm a full-time beer writer and educator. Was doing a lot more events before COVID, so now I'm doing more writing than events, but lead tastings and pairings and educational classes and things like that. Write for regional, national, international beer publications. Also run a podcast called Bean to Barstool that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. Got into beer in a pretty boring and pedestrian way for a white guy in my 40s. You know, just started drinking IPAs and things like that back in the 2000s.
So you did get into beer kind of later in life like that?
So I turned 21 in 2003, and I would say 2005 or 6 was when I started drinking craft beer. I didn't come over from drinking, bricks of Miller Lite or something. For whatever reason, like many people, had the opinion that beer was trashy and wine was fancy. And so instead of drinking shitty beer, I was drinking shitty wine. And I had a friend who worked at a liquor store and turned me on to a few different things. I think I had, some Blue Moon and Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And then there was a camping trip my family took to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We've been going up there since before I was born even. And there's one gas station in the town, and my sister and I went in to grab some beer to take to the campground and found Great Lakes Edmund Fitzgerald and Bell's Two Hearted, and bought both of them because of the labels. Didn't know anything about beer.
Wait, you're the only person in the world that bought Bell's Two Hearted because of the label?
I love that label. I will defend that label to the death. I know that there are some haters. One prominent one. He's a great guy, but one prominent hater. And I will defend that label. I think you have to understand the region and be from around the Great Lakes to love that. But actually, I wrote a big article on Two Hearted a couple years ago for Pellicle out of the UK, and the original label artist reached out to me and told me his story, and it was absolutely fascinating. So I will go to my grave defending the Two Hearted label.
I will put a link to that article if I can remember to do it. Note to self when you're editing this, put a link in the show notes to that article because, the beer, we don't need to kind of explain how great Two Hearted is as a beer, but there is something like even some of those classic beers, and Edmund Fitzgerald is probably one of them. I don't know what Great Lakes artwork looks like today, but it probably has evolved a lot since that Edmund Fitzgerald that I remember from early days of craft beer. they evolve and they change and they get more modern and they get more marketable, I guess. And there is something kind of this throwback thing about Two Hearted that still feels good to me in some kind of way.
Yeah.
Although
it's not technically, what we have now is not technically the original label. They had another label of, if I recall, it was like a Fisherman or something back when the beer was just a periodic release in the 90s. And then when it got its full release year round in 2003-ish, somewhere in there, is when they went over to that Trout label. My guess is that Trout label will be around as long as Larry Bell is.
At this point, it kind of has to, even beyond that. Like, it's become iconic, and like, how do you? I guess I shouldn't say, if we saw, Boston Lager remastered, I guess anything can happen in beer. But so your road into craft beer, then, was it still very kind of? I don't know a good word for it. Kind of food related. Like, was it?
Not really. Like I didn't get into it through like pairing or anything like that. I mean, I didn't drink that much, so this was just what we had on. There was a 6-pack in the fridge for a night that you wanted a beer, but they certainly weren't craft beer geeks yet where we're going out and buying everything to try it. So for a while, there were just a few different beers that I cycled between when I was going to be drinking, and it was probably 2010 or 11 that I decided to start getting into this more. I liked the idea of being able to learn about a beverage, whatever it was going to be, and beer conveniently is the most affordable of those, right. And had so much ready variety. So you can, while you may not be able to tell apart two different hop varieties or parse the difference between a Pilsner and a Helles, you can tell the difference between a Porter and an IPA. So like you can begin that kind of education pretty quickly, and there's some kind of early rewards to just learning very basic things. And I think that kind of got me on that treadmill of wanting to dive in.
Yeah, I think beer, obviously, like from a culture standpoint, it's more approachable. But from a drinking standpoint, I think it's more approachable. From a story standpoint, I think it's more approachable. Like there's so many aspects about beer that I think make it easy for people to kind of start finding their way into it. Wine is super intimidating for people. There's
I think so much of that is just cultural, though, because I feel like there are more challenging flavors in some beers for people to turn. Sure. I mean, bitterness is an immediate one. How many people say, I don't like IPAs, and because of that assume they don't like beer because they don't like that hop bitterness and those old school IPAs. Whereas wine, it's intimidating because of the culture that's come up around it, and people feel like they're not allowed to say anything about it until they are a master, and they feel like they're going to get looked down on or made fun of. Beer has that, person on the street type of vibe to it, where it doesn't carry with it, or in most cases does not carry with it
might start getting there a little bit now.
It certainly has in plenty of circles, but doesn't carry with it that automatic intimidation, even though some of the flavors I think are more esoteric and difficult to for people to approach.
I think people, it feels like you can pick up a beer, and even if you are a new drinker, you can still pick it up and be like, yes, that's good, or it's not. Oh, that's super drinkable. There are things that people feel comfortable being able to talk about, even if they know nothing about beer, versus wine. Like people tend to kind of, again, that intimidation of just getting kind of sucked into your belly. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to say anything. It's interesting, but that's probably a whole different show. So after you kind of get into craft beer, at what point does it start to take on this other role in your life? And, maybe I'm making an assumption, but start to take over.
Well, like I said, I started learning more maybe 2010 or 11, and it was kind of a steady growth for probably the next 4 or 5 years of just, you learn more, you think you understand beer, and then it's like, oh no, okay, there's a whole nother layer. And so you go back through everything that you understand and you deepen it just a little bit, and you keep doing that over and over. I was in a job in 2016 that I enjoyed the work. I did not enjoy the work environment, and so I needed to get out of that. And I had already started kind of more intentionally building my beer knowledge, working toward getting my certified Cicerone exam taken, had started doing like some free tastings at our public library, just doing like educational talks there and stuff, and decided, you know what, why don't I just like dive in all the way on this? I already was doing writing, doing literary reviews and all sorts of stuff. So I was like, why don't I just see if I can make a go of this, writing about beer and food and drink in general. And so quit my job at the beginning of 2017 and started from the ground up, started building my freelance career from there, and then just steadily learning and growing from there. Got my certified Cicerone certification shortly after I left my job, and then got my advanced Cicerone. Let's see, I passed that in 2021. I think that's right.
And then from there, you've kind of built this personality around kind of the deeper looks into beer, especially, we see a lot of your work here locally about a lot of the Ohio breweries that we all kind of know and love, and the digs that you're doing into the stuff is that next level of this is maybe one of the problems about beer, is that it is so approachable, and anybody can easily kind of talk about their relationship with beer, and it leaves a lot of kind of very surface level written interaction with the beer and the breweries that are around us, and you don't see, I think, as in depth peering into that as you might some other beverages, be it wine or even bourbon. Like I guess bourbon's kind of hitting that more approachable side now too. But especially kind of the wine world. I think when you see people write about wine, you see a lot more in depth writing about it, whereas beer for so long we're not getting that, and so seeing people like you that are kind of taking that time, and there are plenty of people around the country, but for us here in Ohio, there hasn't been a lot of that we've gotten to be exposed to.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with it is that while wine has earned the permission to talk about itself in that way, the pushback has been the snobbery that comes with it, and the the self-aggrandizement and the pinky way in the air that now is easily mockable and potentially very, very gatekeepy. Right. Not even potentially, actively very gatekeepy in many situations. And on the beer side, the challenge that I see is, what are the good things within wine culture that beer can aspire to in terms of deep appreciation for flavor and ingredients, and it's right for a place at the table with food and things like that, while avoiding those pitfalls, which we have not entirely avoided because we already have plenty of gatekeeping and snobbery. But how do we keep the approachability, keep the openness of beer for anybody to be able to come to this while deepening the appreciation and the respect for the beverage?
How do you do that?
You let me know.
How do you even just in your day-to-day stuff where you're writing about beer, how do you take it seriously enough that you do kind of lean into some of those things that could turn into a kind of a more snobby kind of side of things, but still let it feel more approachable, more everyday kind of?
Well, I think one of the things that happened on the wine side was that you had people making prescriptive proclamations that really should have been personal, subjective opinions, right, or their own experiences. So you have a wine expert reviewing a wine, announcing what everybody should be tasting in this wine and exactly how good it is, and you either agree with that or you're wrong. And ironically, some of the pushback within beer has been, okay, we need to get rid of all of that snobby description. We shouldn't be talking about this smells like, a wet rock, or like whatever the more esoteric descriptions are. We just need to be getting back to real basic stuff. And I feel like, ironically, the answer is the opposite. We need to lean into the subjectivity of experience, which means that we really dive into how we as an individual interact with these flavors from a memory and emotion standpoint, how we interact from a memory standpoint with times that we've had beer and who we've had this with, and how that amplified the experience. But we need to do that in a way that maintains that this was my experience, what was yours. And especially from a flavor standpoint, we've seen a lot of great writing in the last couple years. I know Mark Dredge did a really excellent article that just got nominated for a James Beard Award on this, about the cultural and geographical influences upon flavor vocabulary. So it's not just that we taste different things when we taste a beer or wine. It's that we have actual different experiences and vocabularies and catalogs of flavors and aromas that we're able to draw on. So when we sit down at a table with people of different experiences from us and different backgrounds, whether that's geographical, cultural, racial, even religious or socioeconomic backgrounds, the wrong stance to take would be, okay, these are the flavor notes in this beer. Do you get those or not? Right. The correct stance would be, this is what I taste here, and really lean into it. Feel free to be very specific. Just don't do that in a way that is, and if you don't get that, you're wrong. Do that and say, as an invitation then, how about you? And if you are both then going to share tasting notes that are very different from each other, maybe even unfamiliar to each other, then you get to talk about, well, where does that come from? How do you know that? Tell me a little bit about your story. Why do you know what such and such fruit tastes like? I don't even know what that is. And that allows for a personal cultural exchange just around experiencing a beer together. And I feel like that posture allows us to both dive in deep. We don't have to just get rid of all that depth of description. We can really dive into it, but it allows us to meet on an even playing field with another person who has a different experience.
Right. Man, to me, there's so much about beer that is about that experience, the experience itself, the experience of drinking it, the experience of remembering something with it. And I think I hesitate to say that Big Beer might have been onto something for years of how they were marketing things, because we know that the taste great, less filling wrestling in a fountain is probably not the way they should have been marketing their beer. But this idea of what that beer was to a lot of people was sports and tailgating and parties, and that was what the beer tasted like to those people. And they might have been onto something, latching onto that and using that
people,
instead of.
It's a cliche at this point, but people should drink what they want. If you want to drink a cheap lager, I don't care. Like, why should I care? Sit down at the table with me. Just neither one of us should be giving each other shit for it.
Right. Yeah, sometimes I like to give people shit for it. I want to come back to kind of some bigger picture beer stuff in a little bit, but I want to talk about being to Barstool, because talk about kind of the nerdy side of beer. Talking about pairing beer and craft chocolate together is pretty nerdy.
and pretty niche. My stats bear that out. Pretty niche audience on that. I got into craft bean to bar chocolate 5-6 years ago, and
before we define a little bit what that means, bean to bar.
Yeah, so we needed a little bit of chocolate education before that'll even make sense. So chocolate is made from the seed of a fruit that grows on a tropical tree, Theobroma cacao. And this tree grows within about 20 degrees north and south of the equator all around the globe. In most of those places where it is, no, that's inaccurate. In some of the major places that crop is grown, there are some significant human rights violations taking place with the labor on the farms, including child labor, child slavery, significantly undercompensated employer.
We saw that in the coffee world a lot too.
Yeah, it's very similar. It's a very, very comparable problem. And a huge, really most of the commodity cacao that is going into the, supermarket chocolate brands is tainted with these human rights abuses, and the companies have been called out on that, and they have, there was a Supreme Court case about it a couple years ago. They know about it, and they just keep kicking the can farther down the road and saying, yep, we'll get there. We'll fix this problem, and they're never going to. So
sounds like big business to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the bean to bar chocolate movement sprang up it began in the late 90s, but really kicked off about 15 years ago or so, with makers who had two goals. They wanted to both make sure that everybody along the supply chain was being taken care of, adequately compensated, not abused in any way, which meant that the cacao was a lot more expensive. And with that, wanted to do similar to what the early craft brewers wanted to provide more flavor and quality and variety. So the term bean to bar refers to the process of making chocolate from the cacao bean all the way through the entire process. What most of the candy makers are doing is somebody else is processing that. They're getting kind of a blended chocolate liquor that they're then using to make their confections from. Bean to bar chocolate makers are getting the beans traceably, transparently. They know where it came from. They're getting reports that say how much it cost and how much farmers were paid. And there are a few different organizations who are vetting those sources to confirm that everything is running as it should on the ground. And then they are taking that and they are doing the work to process that all the way through to a finished chocolate bar. The bean to bar chocolate world, more broadly, we're referring to it more as the craft chocolate world now, because it is entirely possible to be making ethical and delicious chocolate with chocolate that somebody else made and then you're remelting. So to be a little bit more inclusive there and a little bit more accurate, we usually are calling it craft chocolate now. But that craft chocolate world is as varied and vibrant and exciting as craft beer is to me. It's fascinating.
I could see that. It's not as in your face the way craft beer has been.
Yeah, it's not as visible. It's a much smaller industry
but I could see that the culture side of it being kind of that same feeling as craft beer. What got you into craft chocolate? How did you find your way into that?
I was way overconfident.
Of course.
I was way overconfident in accepting an invitation to lead a beer and chocolate pairing, and figured, well, how hard can that be? So came down to talk to London Co., who runs a business here in Dayton called Peace on Fifth, which, if anyone listening, is not actually on Fifth anymore. She sets up at the 2nd Street Market every week, but she is a craft chocolate evangelist, and came down to her just to get a few bars and get a little bit of, recommendations on what I was tasting. And She is a just enthusiastic teacher and evangelist, and you can't get out of her presence in under like 45 minutes, because she'll just have you tasting different things and telling you all about, what you're tasting. And I quickly realized that, first of all, I was in over my head on that first pairing that I did all those years ago, but then realized that, like, wow, this is all of the things that I love about beer. It's accessible. You have both the excitement on the agricultural side and the ingredient side, but then you also have creativity of makers who are just putting all sorts of different cool ingredients in their bars, and you have cool packaging and branding. And
well, it is really similar to craft beer in that anybody can pick up a beer and be like, oh, this is I like this, or I don't like this. Mm-hmm. And the same with chocolate. You can pick up chocolate. Well, I like chocolate. But you can also kind of start to scrape away at it and find those other layers of either cultural things or flavor things, or like you said, the marketing, the branding kind of stuff that you can get really super geeky about. And
well, I fell down the rabbit hole real hard on that one. Within as soon as I discovered that, I within like a year or two, I was going full speed on that.
So then you do a lot of, like you said, the tastings where you're pairing different chocolate with different beers. I've never even thought to do that. Like I think the first time I did a beer and cheese pairing, I think kind of blew me away. This idea that there are these other foods out there that you don't necessarily associate with pairing with beer, especially. I think there's still a lot of people that don't think about pairing things with beer at all, let alone some of those more kind of those more typical kind of wine centric foods, like cheese or chocolate. But I find it super interesting. How did the podcast come about then?
Yeah, there was a few different things behind that. I mean, I got the idea to launch this in early 2020, actually before the pandemic started, and
there was a what?
Yeah, I know, right? You might have heard about it in the news. I wanted to do, there's a couple different motivations. For one, I was just fascinated by this, and nobody was exploring it. I didn't feel like anybody beyond, the occasional beer and chocolate pairing that would pop up at a brewery or something, nobody was actually giving attention to the overlaps here. And I'm like, is anybody else seeing like all the stuff that these have in common? So I just wanted to explore it, but also I recognized the need to develop a platform alongside the freelance stuff I was doing. I didn't really have anything that I was directing people back to. I was doing all these freelance articles and events, but they were just kind of these one-off things, and wanted to build something that both had a lot of flexibility in it. I can explore a lot of different things from that basis, but also then was kind of a home base for people to funnel back to. And I hate the terminology of like needing to build a platform and a brand, but let's be realistic here. So if as a freelancer, I wanted something that people could kind of, reference back to as my home sort of. So I spent a few months kind of building up my ideas for that, figuring out what I wanted to do, getting my branding together, and then launched in the middle of 2020, which was great. People had nothing to do. So got some early success with that. And I've really seen a lot of buy-in from the craft chocolate world. It's been, I think, a slower process getting beer people to catch on to what I'm doing.
See, I would think it would be like chocolate pairing with beer. I feel like would be something really easy for breweries to be able to incorporate into more like day-to-day stuff that I would think they would embrace.
And I've done, some talks and things on how breweries can do that just for themselves. And actually next week I've got a beer and chocolate pairing at Branch and Bone here in Dayton, which tickets are still available for. But what I'm exploring on the podcast isn't just pairing. I'm doing how makers on both sides work with the same ingredients, collaborations between chocolate makers and breweries, exploring just flavor, just how we interact with flavor, and using beer and chocolate as examples, but it's maybe a little bit more agnostic than needing to be beer and chocolate. And so within all of that, just kind of like geeky deep dive stuff, I've noticed a lot more eagerness from chocolate people to just kind of go along for the ride with that. Whereas I think a lot of, and it could be just because we have more media saturation with craft beer. There's tons of podcasts like the one we're on, that beer people maybe see that and think, chocolate. Okay. Maybe I'm going to set that aside and not pay attention. So,
I mean, I've even started to see, with this show, this, like you said, that fatigue of, content creation and podcast or bloggers or whatever it is coming into places from the breweries, especially. It's another one, It didn't used to be that way. And
I think everybody's exhausted right now in general, especially with staffing. People are like, what, really?
And we'll probably talk about that a little bit here in a minute when we talk about some bigger picture stuff. But the project that I definitely want to talk about that I am super, super thrilled about is this Final Gravity.
Yes.
Talk about it. How did it happen? What is it? Explain it to people.
Yeah. So last summer, I wrote and created a self-published zine about pairing beer and chocolate, the Bean to Barstool Guide to Pairing Beer and Chocolate, or something like that. I can't remember the title. And there was nothing on the market that was a guide.
What is a zine first? You have to explain that a little bit.
Right. So a zine, when I say a zine, I think a lot of people hear that and just think I'm saying a magazine. A zine is a self-published, staple-bound, usually home-printed publication that can be passed around or sold very, very easily. And it sprung up, I mean, its roots go back to subversive literature throughout the ages. But zine culture here in the United States really took off in like the 80s and 90s. You had...
It's a very punk rock thing.
A lot of music was about that. I mean, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have an easy way to share information, and none of the major media outlets or publications were necessarily covering the niche interests that people had.
It was a blog before blogs.
Right. No, that's exactly what it was. It was a printed blog. So anybody could make one of these. You know, a teenager in their bedroom, you didn't even have to... It could be handwritten and then Xerox. Like, it didn't even have to be typed. There was no barrier to entry. It was extremely democratic and egalitarian, and these could just be given out to friends. They could be traded with pen pals in the other side of the country. There were zine shops where these were actually sold. You had zine fests where people could go and either buy a whole bunch of zines from other makers or, you know, offer swaps and trades and all sorts of stuff. It was a really, really cool way of publishing. And still alive and going, even though it's not filling maybe quite the essential role that it had initially. But there's still a thriving zine culture out there. And I've had people asking me over the years, like, if I'm going to write a book, and what are you going to write about? And I certainly have considered it, and especially when I was looking at this pairing zine, there was nothing on the market about pairing beer and chocolate. But then I was thinking, like, okay, let's say I can get a book for this. Let's say a publisher decides that's an interesting enough idea. I am now selling them my entire platform. Like, I am now giving them the rights to all of the knowledge I have about this topic, and I'm going to make about $1 because nobody makes any money selling books, especially not at least not making money at the scale that we'd be talking about selling this. So I'm going to do all of this work, not make any money, and I've just given away my entire platform. So of course, there's some prestige that goes along with getting a book deal. And I was like, you know what? I think I can swallow the pride on that, and I can make this thing, and I can keep it, and I can sell it for myself however I want and change it as I need to. If I need to update it, I don't need to worry about an entirely new edition needed coming out. I can go into the file and I can fix the word or change whatever the thing is. So I decided I would publish this zine. It's gone really well. It's available on the Bean to Barstool website. I did another one on a different topic this past winter. And then my wife and I started talking about, wouldn't it be cool if there were a quarterly or periodical beer zine that published articles that maybe weren't finding an easy home other places, not because they were poorly conceived stories, but maybe they're very, very niche, maybe they're very, very personal, and so they don't have the same kind of wide appeal that somebody who's dependent on clicks is going to need to worry about. Wouldn't that be cool? And we can provide, we can provide one more paying market too for beer writers, as we're generally seeing markets close for that.
Right.
And with the very, very low cost of printing a zine and creating it, like, you don't actually have to sell that much to not be losing money on this. So started building the ideas around it and decided to call it Final Gravity. And our first issue is going to come out in June. It'll be quarterly after that. You can pre-order it on beantobarstool.com or support us on Patreon. You can subscribe if you do it through Patreon. And our first issue, I'm finishing up laying it out right now, and the stories we have in there are absolutely fantastic. Just great beer writers writing really personal stories that I feel like we're not seeing in a lot of places.
Well, and it's not just articles about beer. It's not just people talking about this next beer that's coming out.
Yeah, we're not doing anything newsy or like trend coverage or that kind of thing. Like, it is much more like in-depth human connections to, like, the stuff we've been talking about, human connections to beer. And what's one thing that we're doing with this is it's not just freelance beer writers. We are actively trying to get people in the industry to write. So we've got a couple, Betty Ballas from Fibonacci, Betsy Lay from Lady Justice Brewing out in Colorado. We're getting brewers and owners and things writing about beer, not just necessarily writing about their brewery, but writing about either their experience or their perspective on beer that is not getting told otherwise, because any interview they're doing is about what's going on at their brewery. And we're hoping, we don't have this in issue 1, but we're hoping to be able to get more people in the industry at all levels, bartenders, cellar people, whatever, just doing some creative writing, just so we can include like some, if there's an assistant brewer out there who writes poetry or flash fiction, well, let's get a couple into this.
Limericks count? Because I do know a lot of them that write limericks.
I think that's going to be a hard sell, but let's get a couple of those in there and show that people in the industry are not just, it's like, kids who see the teachers during the summer and you're like, why aren't you in your coffin for the summer? Aren't you
why are you
supposed
wearing
to be
shorts? What is going on?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, people in the beer industry do other things.
Well, and from a bigger kind of perspective, kind of a nerdy writing perspective, writing has gotten its butt kicked because of the internet and because of you talk about writing for clicks, and it's a difficult thing if you're running a website and you're trying to put out content. To find that balance between you need traffic and you need people clicking on stuff, and you want to write things that actually mean something and feel something, and that's that balance is very hard to hit.
Yeah, and I don't blame editors, who have to consider that when they're looking at a story. They might agree that an idea is a great story, but they know that it's not going to get clicked on, and so it's like I don't blame them, but there's got to be somewhere to tell these stories.
I think a lot of new bloggers too that I've noticed people start writing the way they see things being written, and so they start seeing these big publications putting out stuff and like, okay, well, this is how this is what an article is supposed to look like, and it's like, oh man, it's like
blogs are not passion projects like they used to be, and that was what made them appealing. And you're spot on about the zines being blogs before blogs. Like you can look at it the other way. Blogs were taking over from what zines were, which was passion projects that were never going to make you money, or you could not count on that happening. And now you're absolutely right. I mean, somebody starts a blog and it's right away like 5 IPAs you need to be drinking right now or something. It's like, you have to know I don't care.
There's almost, and I've never actually put it into an organized document or something, but like there is like like I said, a balance you have to hit. Like I find myself now like, okay, like this month I want to write about this and this, so I have to write X amount of news articles also, and I need to write 3 of those best IPAs you need to be drinking right now, just to kind of get that side of the traffic taken care of, and then get this.
And we do, we do demonize, listicles and things. I remember when I was first getting into beer, I liked those because I just wanted to see what was out there.
Sure.
It was a low barrier to entry, like way
I
to
like
just
the conversation that happens around it sometimes too.
Yeah.
And it starts the argument on the bar, it's
it just can't be all we're doing.
Did you see what he said was the best IPAs?
Right. No, I know before I even put an episode of Bean to Barstool out if it's going to be low traffic or not. Like I know the ones that I'm doing because I think it's interesting and are not going to get anything.
Podcasts are interesting too because and it's the same way with, I guess, blogs and even a zine. It's this, you build this core audience, and that kind of grows over time and keeps growing, and then it starts to not even really matter. I mean, it still matters, but it doesn't matter what the podcast episode is, or that the article that you put out. Like the people that are reading it are still going to read it or listen to it or whatever it is. Like then it starts to become its own thing that has this its own little culture around it, and I think that's where things get
God
fun.
Bless those faithful listeners.
For anybody who downloads this every single week, thank you guys, especially those weeks where things don't really always work out the way they're supposed to, because Lord knows those exist.
Yeah.
Let's go bigger picture. This is the kind of the conversations that I really enjoy. Craft beer in general is in a really weird spot.
Yeah, it is.
How do you personally find that balance as a writer, as an imbiber, as somebody who is just really enjoying craft beer culture, when you get this wave of whatever the next thing is, because
there's so much right now. Like some of it just temporal, everybody is exhausted from the last 3 years, and brewers don't have enough, or brewery owners don't have enough labor, and so don't have time for the fun stuff. I mean, there's that. You have the very troubling and ongoing issues with race and gender stuff within craft beer, of just bad players and bad players actively being bad, and general apathy or lack of ability to put energy toward it from a huge swath of the industry. I mean, we saw that just last week with CBC. I mean, how are we still doing this? Like, how is this shit still happening? So you have that. You have other challenges that brewers are facing with expenses and things like that are tightening the decisions that they get to make for just for passion and excitement, because it's harder to make money at this. You have dropping sales that are kind of putting a pallor over everything, because we have brewers closing down, and others that are struggling to keep the doors open, or having to turn to projects that maybe aren't what got them into this in order to keep the doors open. And I don't say that to demonize any particular beverages that anybody wants to drink, but brewers didn't necessarily get into this because they wanted to make those, and maybe have to. And there's so many different reasons that people are exhausted, and that can spill over for me as a writer, because first of all, the people I'm talking to are not as excited. I can see the exhaustion. I can see that these folks are no longer loving their jobs. Huge swaths of craft beer are exhausted from having to tell us over and over what they've been dealing with. Women and persons of color and LGBTQ plus folks who have been dealing with this shit for forever, and the industry is not responding to them as it should. And so on my side, that both hurts to see that that's happening, and also it narrows the band of what kind of stories feel worth telling. If I'm excited about an ingredient or about a beer, well, how do I celebrate that and act like this other thing isn't going on? Right. Or how do I reach out to that brewer who is dealing with that and expect them to just excitedly tell me about their new hop that they're working with, when they're not being treated like a human being in the industry? It's that kind of stuff is exhausting for me as a writer, and I obviously not anywhere near the level that it is for the folks who are actually dealing with those problems. And so it is hard right now. Over the last year, I have felt for myself a lot of difficulty maintaining my excitement, maintaining my energy level, maintaining my optimism that this is going to be a career going forward. What is craft beer going to be like in 10 years? Is this, how much shrinkage are we going to see? Right. Is this going to become a much smaller? That's probably oversold. But is this going to shrink to the point that now I have to worry about whether or not this is even a thing I can justify covering? And although I think some of those reports have probably been overrated a little bit about losses in market, but it's exhausting, and some days I do better than others. But I've had conversations. I've talked with a malt house owner a few months back who, obviously he's doing something very different than I am, but still is in that position of he's not a brewer. He's watching brewers and having conversations with them. And he was saying the same thing. He's just like, man, every time I talk to a brewer to sell them malt, I can just tell that they are barely holding on. Yeah. They're exhausted. It's really hard to then tell them, well, okay, buy our malt now, or very hard to get excited with them about this new product that you've got when you can tell they're trying to keep the lights on. And it's exhausting all around.
It also becomes harder than to when you see somebody that then decides that a huge part of their taproom presence or their sales are going to be a cotton candy flavored seltzer or whatever the next thing is. Mm-hmm. because that's what people are just yelling about and what people are clamoring. It's like you get tired of fighting that fight when you have these other things that are happening too, or you know, the list of things that you're dealing with as a business right now, as a craft brewer, is so long that it's like, how do you keep going down this road and fighting this battle when in the grand scheme of things it's so far down on your list as a person. And
that's the thing, like you have these much bigger, very, very legitimate issues that are sitting over everybody. Economics, all of the industry's failures with DEI stuff. It's like anything else is immediately less important than that, which should be. But those things that are less important are also probably the fun little things that got you excited about this. And I don't know what we're going to be looking at in a couple of years of what the industry is going to look like.
I mean, on one side of things, I think the consumer, as far as beverages or taste or being interested in better products, is higher than it's ever been. I think people are primed to experience craft beer or craft food or anything in a better way than they've ever been. Mm-hmm. But it's also happening at the same time that all these other big issues are kind of coming to a head, and does one tear the other apart? And
well, also with that, you know, just keeping this purely to the products themselves and setting aside that bigger picture stuff for a minute, that excitement across food and drink segments, in some ways, while it was one of the goals of these early craft beverage or craft food industries, has also circled back around and kind of hurt the individual segments where that interest is somewhat segment agnostic now. So especially we're seeing that with Gen Z, where we're being told repeatedly that they are not loyal to beer, to wine, to anything. They are drinking a different thing anytime they're drinking, which makes sense when you have achieved the success of getting all of these industries to actually be doing cool stuff. And well, no kidding, they're trying all these different things. That's cool.
Well, but for years, that's what craft brewers were telling people to do. Like, just try new things. Try something that you haven't tried before.
Well, and I think one of the very things that makes craft beer so appealing, the variety, the fact that there's so many different classic styles, and then beyond classic styles, you've got so many things you can do with different, you know, adjunct ingredients and hybrids between that. The very thing that made that exciting is also what made it impossible for people to understand.
Right.
Like, you can do beer education all day. 95% of people are never going to care enough to actually understand what those different styles are and create any sort of like systematic understanding. They just want to enjoy what they're drinking. They just want to maybe try something new. But so that very excitement that made a very small subset of us decide, you know, we're all in. We're going to learn everything there is about this. Also turned and kind of was a barrier for a lot of people getting in, because they look at all of craft beer and see, okay, there is way more here than I'm going to be able to understand. So I'm just going to kind of sit back and I'm not going to bother. Where maybe with another beverage, they might have a little better luck, at least getting a lay of the land.
Right. God, that's kind of depressing to think about.
Yeah, I know. This has been depressing me for the last year or two.
What gets you excited about craft beer and the craft industry right now?
I get excited when I see new stories from people who probably would not have had access to the industry 5, 10, 15 years ago. Persons of color and women and different things that were more aberrant success stories earlier on in the industry and noteworthy just because they existed. Now it's like, okay, we're actually seeing some people get to like put themselves and their culture into what they're doing in really, really cool ways. So I get excited about that. I still get excited about ingredients when people are working with cool stuff. I mean, that's that's kind of the part of the basis of Bean to Barstool was like brewers who are actually working with ethically sourced cacao and doing really cool things with it. I still get, geeked out about, oh, wow, you're doing what process? You're using an ingredient how? Like that's really, really cool. And I think seeing, and this is something that I have to do more as a spectator, but seeing the excitement for beer popping up in places around the world that you would not historically think of as beer cultures has been really cool, and something that I think for those of us who, if we do end up maybe disillusioned a little bit with craft beer here in the U.S., depending on what happens with the market in coming years, might be where we go to get those recharges. Places like Vietnam and South Africa and like places, Brazil. My goodness, Brazil has an amazing craft beer scene right now. Like places that somewhat followed along with the U.S.'s craft beer scene, but are incorporating ingredients from their own culinary traditions and things like that. I think is just so cool. I was talking with the episode of my podcast that's going up today is with a chocolate maker in Hong Kong who is working with a brewery there to make a chocolate bar with beer ingredients. But like, there's craft beer everywhere, and I feel like because it's younger and newer in some of those places, it still has that vibrance and that newness and excitement around it, which I think is really cool.
But maybe they can learn from some of the mistakes that we made.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And maybe do it a little different. But if people want to know more about you, about any of the projects we've talked about, what's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, sure. Well, you can learn more about me specifically and see what events and freelance writing I'm doing at davidnilsenbeer.com. I'm also David Nilsen Beer on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. beantobarstool.com is where you can find the podcast and the Bean to Barstool blog, as well as the shop where you can order all the zines that we just talked about. The Final Gravity zine that I mentioned that is forthcoming, you can pre-order on beantobarstool.com, or from the Bean to Barstool website, you can get to our Patreon to subscribe or support us there, and you can follow Bean to Barstool on all of those same social platforms as well.
I appreciate you making time for me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on.
Working on some really, really cool stuff. A different side of things than I think we often deal with on my side of things with this show or with any of the stuff that I do. So I appreciate it a lot, and I'm so excited to see all of this happen. Especially, man, that Final Gravity is going to be so much fun.
Yeah, I am so excited about it, and I'm so excited about the stories we already have in there. We're lining up the stories for issue 2 already, and it's going to be awesome. So definitely check it out.
Get on there, support it, guys. And speaking of support, if you want to support this show, you can go to thenarlygnome.com/support, and you can find our Patreon page there, or just share with your friends. That's really kind of the way all of this stuff keeps growing. Just tell somebody that you think would like this about it, and it'll keep growing. And we'll be back next week. We have another kind of Dayton-ish show next week. I promise it's not Dayton Brewcast. It's just pure luck. Cincy Brewcast. It's the voice of Cincy Craft.